As soon as the lieutenant had returned, arriving back in camp from company headquarters, Anslow's interest had been piqued. He had watched on, impassively, as Kendrick had made directly for his tent, disappearing inside without making any eye contact. The hapless officer now almost certainly trying to find the words for the difficult conversation he would shortly be having with his men. Continuing to clean the working parts of his rifle, which were methodically laid out on the ground before him, Anslow whistled loudly for Private Bird to come and join him. As the slow-witted infantryman materialised at his side, the corporal ordered him to assemble the rest of their number for the expected briefing, his eyes remaining permanently fixed on the closed flap of the officer's tent throughout their brief interaction. Gradually, whilst the remaining members of his section settled down alongside him, the NCO finished reassembling his rifle, easing the weapon's action back and forth several times until he was finally satisfied that everything was once again in working order. Accepting the cigarette which had now been offered to him by one of the arriving soldiers, Anslow rested for a moment, taking in the various conversations which were now taking place around him. As had always been the way, all throughout this bloody and brutal conflict, the familiar accents of his fellow Midlanders, briefly conjuring more comforting memories of his home. Prior to the war, the likes of himself and Billy Bird had been members of a criminal gang within their native black country, named the Essington Strappers. Little known outside their local area, the group's title had arisen from their habit of wrapping heavily buckled leather belts around their fists whenever violence was required. As their first members had inevitably been drafted for military service, their leader Saul Hodgson had ensured the remainder of their number quickly volunteered for service. The reasoning behind this move being it would be better for the gang to endure and survive the war all together, dependent on one another, rather than slowly watching their organisation bleed dry like their Birmingham rivals. But the gang leader's dreams of the post-war reclamation of his former territories had been dashed with his death during one of the unit's first engagements on the Western Front. 3 years later, Carl Anslow now found himself the group's most senior surviving lieutenant, continually fighting to keep his remaining peers alive amidst the insanity they'd been thrust into. This had proven particularly difficult under the watchful eye of their previous commanding officer, another Midlander by the name of Armitage. Anslow had soon found himself clashing with the lieutenant, who rather unfortunately had been a police officer prior to the outbreak of hostilities. But over time, the horrors they faced had forged a grudging alliance between the two, which had ended with Armitage losing a leg and being shipped back to England. His replacement, the far more timid Mr. Kendrick, had gone on to prove much easier to manipulate, a fact the corporal felt greatly increased the chances of he and his associates successfully surviving the conflict. The look on Lieutenant Kendrick's face when he finally emerged from his tent had quickly turned to that of a condemned man, clearly unprepared for his entire company to now be sat waiting for him to address them. He approached uncertainly, clearing his throat loudly and then waving for Anslow to come across and join him. But the corporal had mockingly returned the wave, instead finishing what remained of his cigarette, refusing to be drawn into the officer's confidence. With a heavy heart, Kendrick had therefore been forced to present himself before the assembled throng, addressing them all when he would clearly rather have filtered his commands down via the NCO. A squad of volunteers were required for a mission due to a series of incidents that had taken place in and around a cluster of rural villages they had just fought to take control of. Out on the edge of their left flank, one of the several Belgian companies that had covered their attacks had experienced a number of horrifying losses in the aftermath of the battle. Several sentries had been found viciously murdered at their posts during the hours of darkness, the attackers having apparently emerged from a nearby tunnel network in order to carry out the killings. A patrol that had been pulled together to go down into the tunnels had failed to return back up to the surface, save for a pair of severely wounded soldiers who had returned babbling about savages and madmen. The incident bore the hallmarks of similar occurrences that had taken place elsewhere on other battlefields. It was suspected that those responsible were groups of deserters and mentally broken unfortunates, who had formed small groups of survivors that inhabited the remains of no man's land. As the company pushed on in an effort to recapture Bruges from the retreating Germans, the volunteers would remain behind to assist the Belgians in resolving their bloody issue. There was a short pause, as each of those assembled digested what their commanding officer had informed them, before several hands slowly rose up from amidst the group. Moments later, Anslow himself arose, waving away the other volunteers, announcing that he and his people would be remaining behind to assist the Belgians. Kendrick's protest that he had personally volunteered to resolve the issue and would need Anslow to command the rest of the company died in his throat under the corporal's steely stare. With a weak nod, he then turned on his heel and walked helplessly back to his tent, his hopes of being free from both the front line and his obstructing NCO now firmly dashed. As the war-weary survivors of the South Staffordshire Regiment had struck camp, falling in with the rest of their division, Carl Anslow had quietly congratulated himself. Whilst the battalion and Lieutenant Kendrick would again be thrown up against the desperation of the Kaiser's retreating forces, he and his kin could now safely remain behind, well clear of the conflict. Having elected to rest up for a further hour or two, the patrol had finally moved out, making their way east towards the Belgian positions at a leisurely pace. As a result, the first signs of nightfall had already come to pass when they eventually meandered into the command post, as identified by Kendrick's orders. The NCO stood waiting to greet them, regarded the ragtag group of Englishmen with suspicion and resentment, before solemnly motioning for them to fall in and follow. Several minutes later, Anslow and his fellow strappers found themselves being addressed by a lieutenant named Mays. When the officer spoke, his words were in turn translated on by Berg, the sergeant who had just escorted them to meet with him. But whilst the gloomy adjutant had been relaying the urgency of the situation to the English soldiers, Anslow had largely ignored him, focusing instead on Mays, taking in the telltale signs of nervousness and apprehension etched across the officer's features. As he did so, he found his assessment of the young lieutenant was markedly different to that of his own commanding officer. The visible injuries the man had suffered, and his palpable frustration, more indicative as a man aware he was out of his depth, as opposed to one lacking courage or imagination. The briefing over, he and his patrol had then been given a brief period with which to eat and prepare for their allocated task. It was clear from looking at the Belgian infantrymen, readying themselves around them, war had not been kind to them. The years they had spent manning the defensive line that had been tolerated by their German invaders had clearly been harsh. Yet at the same time, whatever privations they'd faced, these clearly did not compare to those experienced in the trenches by Anslow and his own people. Things had gone wrong before they even reached the tunnels that had been identified as the likely base of their opponents. Up ahead from where the strappers had been walking, there had been the sound of raised Belgian voices, followed by a volley of gunshots. Hurrying forwards, Bird and Anslow found the Belgian sergeant on the ground, a bloodied wound to his shoulder, two men lying lifeless alongside him. Berg went on to explain how one of his young charges had issued a challenge when they encountered what appeared to be a fellow patrol walking back towards them from the front line. Seconds later, a brutally accurate cannonade of rifle fire had sounded before the shadowy figures had turned on their heels and disappeared off into the night. Struggling to his feet, the sergeant had shoved away the men Anslow directed to dress his wounds, insisting on binding the injury himself. There had been a brief and testy exchange, Anslow explaining that he and his men were well versed in what lay ahead, that despite his pride, the Belgian should see sense, pulling back his own men and allowing the Midlanders to take point. It had been the arrival of Mays that had eventually decided the matter, Berg visibly disappointed with his lieutenant's agreement that the strappers should move on ahead of his men. With a nod from their leader, the English soldiers holstered their weapons, instead drawing an assortment of blades and clubs from their belts. It was these tools and instruments that had kept them alive during the conflict till this point. God willing, they would do so again. Berg watched on as the group melted away into the darkness ahead, before one returned several minutes later, waving for him to follow. What awaited the Belgians was Anslow and his men, crouched down at the mouth of a large sewer opening, 3 dead bodies laid on the floor alongside them. Stepping forward, Mays inspected the corpses, taking in the scar tissue, the old injuries that crisscrossed their emaciated bodies, all beneath the fresh wounds that had now killed them. It was impossible to tell the army these men came from, devoid of identity tags, the firearms they carried coming from several different nations. Looking up and across to the corporal, he nodded grimly, then unholstered his pistol, leading his men into the tunnel behind the English soldiers. Anslow had hoped the element of surprise could have carried them further, but it would soon become painfully clear this was not to be the case. As disorganised and erratic in nature as their opponents were, their working knowledge of the tunnels in which they dwelt gave them a clear advantage. He and his men had accounted for 2 more of the enemy, both near naked, armed with savage-looking melee tools, before a cry of alarm from a third had echoed down throughout the restrictive corridors. Almost immediately, the patrol now found itself surrounded by endless numbers of pale and ghostly figures, spilling forth from side tunnels. What little light that was still available in the darkness glinted back and forth off the blades and broken glass these people carried. Issuing forth an expletive-laden cry to rally his boys, Anslow buried his bayonet directly into the face of an onrushing opponent, before heaving the body hard into the path of another. Beside him, Bird swung wildly with the mace he previously relieved from the body of a German stormtrooper, nearly decapitating the head of an attacker it connected with. The Englishmen continued to slash and stab away, the screams of their opponents silenced with every blow that landed. But despite their best efforts, the strappers couldn't seem to stem the onrushing flow of pasty and skeletal attackers. Several of their number were by now already gone, good men, torn and beaten to death amidst a wave of savagery. There was a deafening crescendo as the Belgians behind them opened fire, their wild volley thinning the approaching herd slightly before they too ran forward to join the fight. Minutes later, there was silence again, Anslow heaving a heavily tattooed corpse that had come to rest on him over to one side, and then rising to see the price they'd paid for survival. Bird and 3 more of the strappers were breathing, bruised and bloodied, but still able to deliver death to their opponents. The Belgians had fared far worse, only Berg and 2 others remaining alive, all crouched down defensively around the lifeless body of their lieutenant. Struggling to catch his breath as he wiped the blood from his blade against his trousers, Anslow peered up along the tunnel that stretched ahead. Far away came a distant orange glow, accompanied by the faintest suggestion of a sickly sweet smell, one he'd hoped he'd never again have to experience. He looked to Berg, who had by now armed himself with an overly long bayonet, prized free from the dead grasp of one of their attackers. From his hate-filled gaze, it was clear there was no point in asking the wounded sergeant to head back out of the tunnels to search for reinforcements. There were only 2 things left to be done now: to end this nightmare, and to avenge those they'd lost in the process. The surviving members of the patrol continued on along the tunnel for several minutes, unmolested by any opponent. As they'd done so, the light up ahead had gradually become stronger, along with the abhorrent scent of burning flesh. And as the tunnel finally opened out, they found themselves standing in a large terminus, illuminated by a number of flaming beacons. A metal trellis had been thrown together in the centre of this junction, upon which a human corpse, still bedecked in a tattered Belgian uniform, was slowly roasting. The man stood tending to it had ignored them as they entered, going about his business for a few minutes more before turning to face them. He was tall and lean, naked from the waist upwards, his face hidden by a bulky gas mask, to which a rudimentary set of horns had been somehow affixed. All across the front and back of his torso were deep and bloody welts, as if he had been dragged backwards and forwards repeatedly across barbed wire. But it was the remains of the tattoo on his right shoulder that Anslow could not help but stare at, in utter disbelief. An all too familiar red shield, emblazoned with a yellow cross. The same symbol that had been adopted as a club crest by his beloved football team, in the hometown he had left behind to come and fight in this place. He was still staring hard at the nightmarish figure, for any glimmer or sign of recognition, when it had stepped back and away from him. With slow and deliberate movements, this slender monster raised its mask slightly, producing a metallic object from one of its trouser pockets as it did so. By the time Anslow and the others had recognised the item for what it was already against the figure's cracked and pursed lips. But the shrill whistle blast they had expected did not come, its silent scream instead foreshadowing a far different sound. A series of throaty and low growls suddenly emanated from further down the tunnel, before a large pair of shadows hove into view. There was a collective chorus of gasps from the watching soldiers, as two large creatures were then illuminated by the torches that hung above the junction. Dogs of some kind, impossibly large, their hulking hides overladen with some form of leather covering, to which nails and pieces of twisted metal had been fixed. The ghoul that stood before them was smiling now, its twisted and lopsided mouth still visible from where it had raised the gas mask to call for its pets. With a deafening roar, the two creatures charged forward as their master stepped backwards, in order to better admire the handiwork of his pets. The first to die were the surviving Belgians, their bullets impacting harmlessly against the improvised armour that had been fastened to the oversized canines. With a cry, Bird had thrown himself towards one of the beasts, bringing the mace down hard across the top of its skull, as it had been bending down to feast upon one of its victims. The blow had been sufficient to stun the monster, but it would be the last act of the Midlander's life, its mate then rending him apart in retaliation for the attack. His eyes fixed on the grinning demon that stood back and behind the attacking creatures, Anslow's heart burned with rage. That this evil, which had claimed so many lives, including those of his final few boys, had apparently been born in the same place as they all had. Emptying his pistol into one of the monsters, Berg caught sight of the corporal retrieving something from his webbing before charging headlong into the fray. Seconds later, the pair of grenades he'd been armed with ignited, the twin detonations tearing the two slavering hellhounds either side of him apart. Both the NCO and the grinning apparition that stood before him had been lost in a rolling wave of smoke and fire, the combined shockwave of the two detonations sending the wounded sergeant sprawling, his head connecting hard against the tunnel wall. When he came to, a few minutes later, all was still. Everything that had been standing before, now broken and scattered around the tunnel floor. Reloading his pistol, Berg advanced on the two creatures, satisfying himself they were deceased. Assurances would not need to confirm the same for their master, of whom very little remained intact. The NCO looked about himself, mourning those he'd lost, and was about to leave when he detected a faint sound further up ahead. A soft and quiet mewling, like that of a wounded animal. Pistol in hand, he then slowly moved up the side tunnel where he observed the creatures to have emerged from. There were three of them, staring back at him as he approached his destination. Puppies, larger in size than a normal dog, but comparatively normal looking beyond this. With a heavy heart he raised the weapon, the memories of their foul parents weighing heavily on his mind. Then the gun had been lowered, before sliding back into its holster, the sergeant leaning down to pick up the helpless trio. The walk back out through the tunnel had been slow, the ground beneath his feet still damp and slippery with blood and human remains, and by the time he'd finally regained the outside world, dawn had broken, the morning light illuminating the slow and lonely walk back towards his command post.